Hello. At least where I live, autumn is coming, and that's the traditional time for winemaking. I take that as an opportunity to tell you something about the processes involved in the production of ethanol and alcoholic beverages. So today we're not talking about electronics, but about applied biochemistry. Why am I doing that? Well, I inherited some winemaking equipment from my grandfather a couple of years ago, and I was basically the first in the family to put it to use in decades. For this video I also heavily relied on the information found in the Kitzinger Weinbuch or Kitzinger Wine Book, as it would be called in English. This issue is from the year 1961. By that time the book had been sold 500,000 times already, showing that its content once was common knowledge. Reading this book and handling the old school equipment from days long since gone also caused the nostalgic touch of this video. But before I will show you how you can produce alcohol at home, I want to give you some reasons for it. Ethanol, also called ethyl alcohol, drinking alcohol, or often just alcohol, is one of the most versatile chemicals known to man. It can, for example, be used as a fuel or fuel additive for combustion engines, an incinerator for coal, moist wood or other materials that are hard to incinerate, a disinfectant, a painkiller when applied to the skin surface, or used internally of course, as a base for pharmaceutical drugs, a detergent, a conservant, and of course, as everybody knows, as a recreational drug. Since this channel is also about self-reliance and preparedness, I would also consider alcohol in the form of alcoholic beverages as a valuable trading good. Should there ever be a time of general distress, alcohol demand will most certainly rise, while its production might decline. There are other kinds of alcohol, like isopropyl alcohol or methanol. When I talk about those substances, I will call them by their correct name. But when I just say alcohol, I will refer to ethanol. The different applications that I have just been talking about require, of course, ethanol of different purity, which means that the production process will somewhat vary depending on the final application. Furthermore, everyone is aware of the unbelievable number of beer, wine and liquor types and brands that exist in the world, and as in many other fields, there is a great deal of confusion about what they are and how they are different from one another. But at their core, the techniques and biochemical processes involved in the production are basically almost always the same, while the biggest differences lie in those less essential processes which are involved in giving the beverage a certain taste. In the center of ethanol production stands simple sugar. This sugar is used as a base material to create ethanol in a process called fermentation. The processing itself is done by microorganisms, usually some form of yeast. And that's why we are talking about a complex biochemical process rather than a simple chemical reaction. The biggest issue, however, is now, and was in the past, the question of how to supply the base material. Only few things in nature are rich in fermentable sugars, and that's why our ancestors were very ingenious in processing other materials into sugar before fermenting them to produce ethanol. One material that can easily be converted to sugar is starch. That conversion is a splitting process, because starch is basically a long chain of glucose molecules, which is a simple sugar that can be processed by a yeast culture. The splitting process is traditionally being accomplished by processes called malting and mashing. It is basically the attempt to use natural enzymes, mainly amylase, which splits starch into glucose molecules in yet another biochemical process. Our ancestors could use this technique only because the enzymes are already present in the grains that are, for example, used to make beer. Those enzymes come into action in the malting process. Typical sources for starch are the different kinds of grain, potatoes, rice, and as a more exotic example, the agave plant. Typical beverages that are traditionally made from these base materials are beer, whiskey, vodka, and in the case of the agave plant, tequila. And there are many other kinds of liquors that have starch as their base material. Typical sources that can supply sugars directly are grapes, apples, pears, and other fruits, honey, plants like sugar beet and sugar cane, and yes, even milk. Typical beverages that are made of these materials are all kinds of grape wines, which you might simply know as wines. Furthermore, all kinds of fruit wines, for example cider, which is made from apples. Then of course mead, which is made from honey. And an exotic example is kumis, which is an alcoholic beverage which is made from mare's milk. It is a popular drink among some of the peoples of Central Asia. During the process of fermentation, not only ethanol is produced, but the waste products carbon dioxide and water as well. The absolute maximum concentration of ethanol that can be accomplished by alcoholic fermentation lies normally somewhere between 15 and 17%. Why is that? Well, alcohol is after all a toxin. Once it reaches a certain concentration, the yeast culture dies from its own waste product, which I find to be a sad analogy to what might happen to humanity one day. If, like in the production of all liquors, higher concentrations are wanted, the wine that is the product of the fermentation has to be distilled at least one or even many times. So much for the most basic understanding of the process. But as always, there are some details and exceptions that I should mention. In tequila production, for example, heat is used in a process called baking to split the starch molecules. During the fermentation process, the yeast culture requires other chemicals than sugar and water to survive. These chemicals can be summed up by the term yeast nutrients. In some rare exceptions, microorganisms other than yeast take the most important role in the fermentation process. Examples are the fungi used in the production of sake in Japan and the bacteria involved in the production of pulque, an alcoholic beverage made from agave by some of the native peoples of Mexico. Starch molecules are also called polysaccharides. The Greek prefix poly means many, pointing to the fact that starch is built from a large number of sugar molecules. Many sugars like maltose and sucrose are not simple sugars, but they are so-called disaccharides. Again, the Greek prefix di, meaning the number 2, tells us that they are composed of 2 monosaccharides, which are the simple sugars that yeast wants. Luckily, this last splitting process can be accomplished by the yeast's own enzymes and is thus not a problem. Another material that could be used to be split into simple sugars is cellulose, maybe one of the most abundant materials in plant life. And many scientists around the world are researching to find a cheap and simple way to do this. Once that goal is accomplished, it would change the entire world of alcohol production. The simplest way to produce alcoholic beverages at home is to make either fruit wines or mead, and that's what I'm going to do in the course of this video. The biggest advantage is that you can use materials that grow in your own garden or in the fields nearby, while no splitting process is necessary. But before I will show you how you can produce alcohol yourself, I want you to understand how and why the methods that I'm about to show you are different from some traditional methods that you might have heard of before. In pre-industrial times, grapes, apples and pears were the only fruits that were widely used to produce wine. Why is that? Well, that's because they were the only fruits growing in Middle Europe that had a high enough natural sugar content to be fermented into a wine with acceptable ethanol concentration. In more modern times, and when I say modern I mean the last 70 years or so, industrial-scale sugar production made it possible to use all kinds of fruits as a source for fruit wines. This also influenced the way in which the fruits are prepared for fermentation. The substance used as a base for the fermentation process is called the must. In traditional winemaking, a mash that contains rigid parts of the fruit as well as the fruit juice is used at least for a part of the winemaking process. The more modern method that I will use in this video is to provide a liquid must, a term that I use for the lack of a better word. That must is basically a mixture of fruit juice without any big rigid parts, water, sugar, yeast nutrient and optionally some more additives. The yeast that comes into action in the traditional process already lives on the surface of the fruits themselves. That's also the reason why our ancestors were able to ferment grapes and other fruits without even knowing about the existence of microorganisms. A more modern approach is to use a sterilized must and add pure breed wine yeast to it. Why would you do that? Well, some wild yeasts produce toxic methanol, unpleasant flavors, and are less able to survive high alcohol concentrations inside the must, meaning that the possible maximum alcohol concentration will be lower. The fermentation method in which a mash is used during the fermentation could be called mash fermentation, while I will use a method by which a liquid must is fermented, which is based on fruit juice that is produced by a method called steam juicing. The traditional method might create a stronger aroma, but has the disadvantages that wild fungi, for example molds, and other harmful microorganisms are introduced in the process. Furthermore, a smaller volume of wine can be produced in a given flask because the rigid parts take up space. But now let's talk about those methods for home alcohol production in more detail, and let me show you how it's done in real life. The basic methods are yeast cultivation and steam juicing, must preparation and fermentation, and, if higher ethanol concentrations are required, distillation. The first thing that you should do before anything else is to prepare a yeast culture that will be able to ferment large quantities of must into wine. For that you need the items lying on the workbench, being an ordinary bottle of apple juice bought in the supermarket, wine yeast and yeast nutrient bought in a drugstore, but available at some online shops as well, an ordinary sheet of paper, a rigid cylindrical object, for example a glass, and a paper towel or similar object to clean the bottleneck. Additionally, you need a bit of absorbent cotton, as you can see here. First, I open the little bottle that contains the so-called liquid wine yeast. The German word Reinzuchthefe means pure breed yeast. Notice the date on the box showing that this footage is actually from last year. Even though the yeast is called liquid, it's actually not. It lives inside a nutritional liquid on the bottom of the bottle. To get it out, it has to be dispensed in the fluid by shaking the bottle. When that is done, it can be given into the apple juice. Please notice that I made a stupid mistake when I filmed this material. The bottle is too full. If you do it yourself, please empty the bottle to at least 2/3 before adding the yeast. When the yeast is inside, you should dry the bottleneck from inside before proceeding. Then you can take the yeast nutrient, which often comes in pill form, and grind it into a powder with the help of the glass and a sheet of paper. Finally, you give it into the bottle. After cleaning the bottleneck again, you can then lock the bottle with a piece of cotton. The idea is that the carbon dioxide gas produced by the yeast can exit the bottle, while fungi and other unwanted substances can't enter, being blocked by the piece of cotton. Later, we will use a more sophisticated object to do a similar job. Now you have to wait a couple of days for the yeast to multiply inside the bottle. After 1 day, you can already see a bit of white foam on the surface. A few carbon dioxide bubbles can be seen rising from the bottom. After 2 days, the fermentation and multiplication process is already in full swing, as can be seen by the foam and the many small CO2 bubbles. While doing this, make sure that the bottle is stored at a warm and cozy place. The cotton should be dry and not be touched by foam or juice. The bottleneck must be dry as well. Under no circumstances should mold be allowed to enter the bottle. The next logical step is to supply some fruit juice that will serve as the base for the must. As I said, I do that with the help of a steam juicer. A steam juicer is basically a pot with water sitting on a hot plate. On top of the pot is a cylindrical metal body that has a hole in the bottom, which is shaped like an upside down funnel. On top of that you have a lid, just like with a normal pot. Inside the body a strainer is placed which holds the fruits to be juiced. From the boiling water, hot steam is then rising through the funnel to the fruits, literally braising them. Under the heat, the fruits open up and release their content. Their natural juice, together with some condensed water, is then dripping through the strainer into a basin that is formed by the funnel. In that basin, the juice is stored and held hot. Once enough juice is collected, it can then be released through a valve. But let's just take a look at the real thing. Last year we had a long summer with a lot of sunshine and there was a lot to harvest. I chose to use a mixture of sour cherry and red currant, which turned out to be a really tasty combination. Here you can see the steam juicer in action. You can choose between collecting the juice and making a must once it's cooled down, or you can conserve the sterilized juice in glass bottles first and use the juice later. I used some of the juice to make some more yeast cultures while I stored the majority of the juice in bottles. In my case, I only wanted to wait a few more days for the yeast cultures to grow. But this method can also be used to store the juice for years or even decades. But the bottles and caps must be totally clean and pre-warmed. The juice must be steaming hot when filled in the bottles. By the way, the juice you see here is not from the cherries in the currant, but from some pears, which I also juiced on that day. When the yeast culture is ready, the juice, water, sugar and some more yeast nutrient is available, it's time to get to the real deal, preparing the must and starting the actual fermentation process. For fermenting fruit wines, a large glass jug called fermenting balloon, balloon flask or similar is the traditional choice. They normally can hold between 5 and 60 liters. You can sometimes buy them for a few bucks in a garage sale. I scored a 25-liter balloon for €4 just a couple of weeks ago. The balloon flask is of course filled with the juice, water, nutrient and yeast culture. It is then closed with a fermentation lock and a rubber plug or similar device. The fermentation will kick in shortly after mixing all ingredients together, as long as the outside temperature is not too cold. Carbon dioxide gas will rise from the fluid to its surface, generating the buildup of a whitish foam. The CO2, which is heavier than air, will push the air out, and a carbon dioxide atmosphere will be building up inside the balloon, which will force all yeast inside to switch over to fermenting glucose to survive. This has the positive side effect that those microorganisms which need oxygen will perish. If everything is done right, the yeast will overpower all other microorganisms in the must and mold will have no chance of spreading inside. The intensity of the fermentation process can from now on be estimated by the amount of CO2 escaping the balloon flask and the foam building up inside. But enough theory, let's take a look at the actual process. The first thing I do is to fill all the cherry and currant juice into the balloon flask. On the right hand side you see several more yeast cultures that I have created by diluting the yeast culture that I had prepared in the apple juice bottle in a larger amount of must based on my self-made juice. I put all of it inside the flask to kickstart the fermentation process. While doing that, I first shake the bottles thoroughly, making sure that the yeast living on the bottom is stirred up. After doing that, a large amount of water is added to the mixture. I follow an old recipe from the Kitzinger wine book and I can give you some recipes for typical fruit wines if you want to. Next I add several kilograms of sugar. And last but not least, yeast nutrient. And with all ingredients inside the balloon, there is a whole lot of shaking going on. So with the sugar being solved, I cleaned the bottleneck and installed the fermentation lock. After just one day, as expected, a large amount of foam started to build up inside the balloon. After 2 days, the foam nearly reached the lock, which would have been bad. I maybe should have used a bigger balloon. But luckily the fermentation calmed down a little bit after the first days and kept a steady pace over many weeks. The best tips I can give you is not to fill the balloon too high, shake the mixture every day to stir up the yeast, which will catalyze the fermentation process, and to keep a warm and stable temperature around the balloon flask, and in general to keep everything clean and sterile. Once the ethanol concentration reaches the critical level, the yeast will die. It will sink to the bottom of the balloon and remain there. You can then use a simple hose, suck on it, and the wine will flow off all by itself. You can then bottle the wine and store it. If you want to produce alcohol with higher concentration, you would need to distill the wine. But that process is illegal in many countries and you should inform yourself about the situation where you live. But other than that, I'm planning on making some mead right now, and maybe I will tell you about that in another video. So I hope you liked this little film and will watch my other videos and subscribe, and I hope to see you soon.